are nights when the fire burns lower and the stories start to gather on their own. You can almost hear them in the wind between the dunes, in the hum of an old neon light, in the rails that never cooled down after the last train passed. Some say these tales are connected, not by people, but by the places that refuse to be forgotten. So tonight, don't think of this as 6 stories. Think of it as one long memory, a quiet echo left behind by the world after midnight. Sit closer to the fire and listen. The night remembers more than it tells. The desert is a slow teacher, and some lessons only arrive after midnight. Out along Route 66, there's a service station that never learned how to close. The books are empty, the sign still burns, and the night keeps a ledger the day won't acknowledge. This isn't about me, and it isn't about miracles. It's a plain account of what a traveler found when the map ran out of certainty, and what he left behind so another set of headlights wouldn't feel quite so alone.
I didn't know the man. I pieced him together later from a receipt with no total, a line in a notebook, and a small scuff on the edge of an old pump that had his tank's height written into it. He reached the old alignment of 66 because the interstate had become a glare. He couldn't sit inside anymore. Out there, the blacktop rises and relaxes with the land, and the sky is more distance than color. Past midnight, the only geometry is what your beams choose to believe. He saw the neon first. Not bright, just enough to say present. Red letters promising open, the kind of promise that usually needs a cashier and a reason. 2 pumps under a modest canopy, a squat office with a window that held a pale rectangle of light. The canopy paint had faded into a shade that used to be white and decided to remember instead. The traveler rolled in with half a tank and a longer reason, killed the engine, and let the desert declare itself. Wind at knee height, insects hoarding one frequency, the far interstate whispering like a conversation you aren't invited to. He stood there for a moment and tested the idea that he could simply drive on. The station kept being the answer to a question he hadn't asked. He lifted the nozzle mostly to see if the mechanism still believed in work. Numbers on the dial paused, took the new instruction, and began their small arithmetic. It was not a place that performed. It continued. The office door had a bell on a spring that pronounced arrivals in one clean syllable. The air inside carried oil, cardboard, and the mild sweetness old coolers exhale. On pegboard behind the counter, keys hung without the doors they'd once convinced, a row of brass tags stamped with numbers that had lost their locks. A plastic plant collected dust like patience. To the right sat a register that remembered prices with buttons the size of quarters. To the left, a radio that had learned one station and didn't mind static standing beside it. A clock over the door insisted it wasn't yet midnight. The traveler would notice that later, but he already felt what the hands were announcing. The room was granting back a few minutes the highway had overdrawn. He didn't call out. This was not a place that entertained the idea of service. It kept to its function. Light, inventory, a place to stand while your heartbeat changed shape. He didn't need coffee. He opened the cooler anyway and closed it again, just to be sure that a thing still answered when asked. Cold came out like an honest admission, aluminum and winter. On the counter sat a spiral-bound ledger with a pencil tucked under its wire. The cover had pale rings where cups had landed, the kind of stain that measures time without asking for a calendar. He set his palm on it as if steadying something. The pencil rolled once and decided to wait. There was no voice to confirm he was welcome. The station had made its declaration with light, and he was already involved. He opened the ledger. The handwriting repeated itself across decades without becoming proud. Careful, leaning slightly, the numbers honest to themselves. Each line recorded a moment in the kind of grammar a place learns when it refuses to close. Time, a brief note, a direction. The present night had already shown itself. An entry earlier read, 12:01 westbound, paused by pumps. Another a few days back, 02:11 return. No purchase marked, just the acknowledgement that coming back is its own transaction. He ran a finger down a page from a year with no reason to be remembered. The ink told a story in short measures. Dust storms that made drivers sit with wipers beating air. A monsoon season when the canopy roof worked harder than the pumps. A winter week, the radio sang to nobody and didn't mind. Some nights listed nothing and still weren't empty, because emptiness takes attendance whether or not you sign. He could have inscribed a name. He chose a simpler truth. He wrote a time. He wrote the word passing. The pencil made a small sound on the paper, like a bug tracing its way across a window. He closed the book and felt the weight of it recalibrate. A ledger expects to be filled and also expects to be wrong, because roads confound accounting. He didn't look for a cashier. He stood and let the neon breathe into the office through the glass and understood the economy on offer. A little light, a few minutes forgiven. A record that said somebody was here and didn't need more than that. Outside again, the desert had changed from large to near. That is what night does when you stand still long enough. The canopy hummed itself steady. The pump face wore a small, square sticker partially hidden by dust. See attendant for time. And below it, the ghost of an older brand's logo, a wing that no longer sold speed. The traveler had already fueled, though he hadn't yet decided why. He lifted the nozzle a second time and let it settle back, earning the gentle reprimand of a relay doing its job. He watched the moths practice persistence against a letter that occasionally dimmed and then returned, a lesson without a moral. A dog far off reconsidered a bark and chose silence instead. The vapor recovery hose sighed. The air smelled faintly of creosote and warmed rubber, a combination that makes memory feel near the surface. On the concrete island, shoe prints and tire arcs told a more legitimate history than any brochure. A darker coin of oil marked where somebody had turned a wrench last season and declared a leak solved. The traveler traced that circle with his eyes and stood with the feeling that places keep track even when nobody asks them to. He looked back through the window at the clock that still held the hands back from where they should have been. A generous lie can be service. Here, it was policy. He wasn't owed anything. He was being lent it anyway. In the office, the radio offered itself without being invited. Not a song at first, a tone that had learned patience, then a wash of static arranged around it. After a while, something with a guitar at its center rose up through the noise. It was not a station he could have found at noon or at 6. Some signals used darkness like a road of their own. The sound didn't ask for nostalgia. It played as if it had been paid already by the fact you were awake. The traveler stood and let the music create walls where the office did not. Between bars, a voice came through, not a personality, just the duty of telling the weather would remain clear. That visibility was good enough if you didn't insist on seeing everything. The radio faded without finishing its thought. The station did not seem offended. He found a map rack near the door. Arizona depicted itself with familiar confidence, but the fold that held Seligman and the old alignments wore an oily thumbprint that had set years ago. Someone had prodded that exact spot until the paper learned it. He moved his own thumb toward it and stopped short, the way you respect a relic by letting it be used only by its past. He wasn't chasing ghosts. He was testing the equipment of being out late with a reason that didn't need speech. The station provided the tools: light, a receipt that wasn't hungry for numbers, a radio that could be counted on to appear only when the sun refused to. He found the stack of blank receipts near the register. No logo, no slogan promising service since a year that had grown expensive. A thin red line across the top allowed for a date. The space remained empty. The traveler pulled one free and made a crease with his thumbnail, not to keep, just to prove the paper would obey. He laid it down and waited to feel foolish. He did not. He had paid in the currency on offer, which was attention, a few careful minutes, the courtesy of writing himself into the ledger in a way that could be read by a stranger later. He set the receipt on the counter where the next set of hands might find it, and consider whether proof is always a number or sometimes a record of standing still. He fixed the pencil's point toward the ledger again, a small alignment that says someone will come after and deserve coherence. The office clock continued its mild disobedience, a face that understood the dignity of being late on purpose. On the door jamb, shallow hatch marks measured heights that no longer belonged to the bodies that had stood beneath them. Some lines had dates without years. Some had initials that were more shape than identity. He touched none of them, but he stood long enough that his own shoulder knew where it would have reached. Outside the glass, the open sign breathed evenly. The canopy paint held the dark back with a modest confidence. The station felt prepared to keep going no matter the count. He stepped out, and the bell declared departure with the same syllable it used for arrivals. The air outside had cooled in a way that made metal smell like a decision. He sat in the driver's seat and did not turn the key. He watched the office through the glass and took inventory of what the place had asked of him, which was nothing that cost tomorrow. He adjusted the mirror and caught the sign's reflection at the angle where neon looks like handwriting. A line laid down to say here, in case someone doubted it. He backed out slow. The road took him with no argument because roads have learned how to agree. In the mirror, the station shrank to a dot that held steady longer than physics would insist. That is not a trick. That is what a promise looks like from a mile away. He stayed on the old alignment a few minutes past where convenience would have turned him back to the interstate. The desert approved without saying so. The receipt rode on the passenger seat and drifted once with a small movement of air, the kind produced when a driver breathes and remembers he is still here. He placed 2 fingers on it at the next bend and let them rest there a while. When he finally merged with the newer road, the station was gone from the mirror, which is not the same as gone. He arrived where he was going later than the dashboard would claim, because those minutes had been lent and already spent where such things are honored. I learned about him weeks later when I found a copy of that receipt taped to the ledger's inside cover and read a note in the same practical hand that kept the books. After midnight, paid in full. The amount field remained blank. The line read, truer that way.
Some places sell fuel. A few sell the part of the night that belongs to no one, and they'll let you leave with it if you stand still long enough to be counted. Out on Route 66, there's a station that keeps its light not because business requires it, but because the dark does. If you pass it, you'll know. You won't need directions, only the courtesy to write your time down and the sense to drive on gently with what you've borrowed. Fires go quiet when they finish their work. Neon does the same. What remains is the road, the ledger, and the steady fact that someone will arrive after you and be less alone because you did. Closer to the fire. Some bridges were built to cross rivers. Others were built to cross time. There's one in Burlington, Vermont. Nothing special by daylight, a wooden span over a narrow inlet. But when the fog rises thick and sound carries sideways, people say you can hear yourself on the other side. Not your echo, not your voice, but a version of you that never left. Tonight's story isn't about ghosts. It's about how memory answers when no one's calling.
This is not my story. It belongs to a retired music teacher named Howard Linton, a man who never learned to walk without measuring rhythm in his steps. He lived 3 blocks from the lake in a single-story house with a small porch and a wind chime that chose its own key. That autumn, fog started arriving early, the kind that cancels color and replaces it with texture. The neighborhood went quiet in the mornings, as if volume knobs had been politely turned down. On the worst days, the church steeple dissolved at the bell, and the waterfront path became a hallway with no walls. Howard kept his routines. He rose before 7, warmed water for tea, checked the barometer by the kitchen window, and tied the same scarf he'd worn since he still taught scales in classrooms. After breakfast, he would take the footpath that hugged the inlet and cross the wooden bridge that arched just enough to make the far end disappear when the mist grew heavy. He liked the sound of his soles on wet planks. The boards answered in low notes, one for each length of timber, and he had learned the pattern years ago, the way some people memorize prayer. The week it began, he noticed a second tone under the footfall. It arrived like a held breath, not loud, not trying to be noticed. He stopped halfway over the water, leaned on the rail, and listened. The tone sat exactly on the pitch he used to test beginners. A clean, open D, no wobble, no vanity. The lake didn't move much. The reeds along the bank made a soft scraping he knew by heart. Yet the note stayed until he stepped again, and then it followed at the same distance, as if the bridge had a slow echo that had only just remembered how to answer. Fog changes proportions. Fences move closer, houses regain their childhood sizes, and time develops a hinge. The next day, the tone returned and brought a thin harmonic with it, something like a second string stirred by sympathy rather than touch. Howard tested the rail with his knuckles, the way he would test a piano with a fingertip from long practice. The wood sent back a polite thump, nothing more. On the town side of the span, the newspaper box looked newly painted. On the lakeside, the rocks gathered at the footings appeared blunter, as if younger hands had placed them. He told himself, air tricks are older than caution, and kept walking. In the afternoons, he sorted music he no longer needed and kept the pages that still taught him something. He had a drawer where letters went to wait. They were addressed to former students, to a brother in Montpellier he hadn't called in years, to a woman he had once promised a trip to Tanglewood and instead given a rain check that never found its calendar. None had stamps. Few had dates. Most ended mid-thought. He read them in the armchair that left a permanent oval in the rug. When he closed the drawer, the wind chime took a single step along the scale and stopped on that same D, an obedient weather vane. He began carrying his tuning fork again. It lived in a felt sleeve, silver blunt at the ends, honest about age. He would tap it against his wrist on the porch and listen for decay time, an old habit from days when room tone decided whether a lesson would be productive. The fork rang as it always had. The neighborhood held it a fraction too long. A name kept returning when he read Clara. She'd been a teenager with a piano that insisted on drifting flat, but a sense of timing that corrected most sins. She left for Boston on a scholarship, promising to visit on breaks, then moved through years the way some move through doors and never looked back. In the drawer was a letter to her that never reached a stamp. He had written it the week he retired. The lines were neat, the ink dark, the tone too careful. At the bottom, he had added a note he couldn't remember composing. You still owe me a D major. The morning after he found it, the fog felt newly made. The lake lay without texture, just luminance. The floating dock further down shore had no edges until a gull landed and carved a brief geometry from the gray. He struck the tuning fork at the middle of the span. The bridge replied, not with the metallic twang wood sometimes pretends to, but with a tone that matched and then stabilized, as if it had been waiting for permission. He moved the fork closer to the rail, and the sound grew quietly sure. He stood there long enough that joggers became silhouettes that hesitated and reconsidered their routes. He folded the letter into his coat pocket, a neat rectangle where the paper could learn the shape of his body. The air on the far end of the bridge looked brighter, or simply less certain about being opaque. He decided to come earlier the next day to find out whether dawn respected ordinary agreements. Before sunrise, Burlington belongs to delivery trucks and one dog per block. Howard left before they started, moving carefully to avoid slipping on leaves that the fog had turned into small rumors of ice. The bridge emerged from the path slowly, a rib against the pale. He placed his palm on the first post and felt water living inside the grain. The gulls had not yet committed to mourning. A buoy bell on the outer channel sounded as if it came from underfoot rather than out on the lake. He reached the middle and waited. The tuning fork felt cool and smooth against the skin. He tapped it, and its clean pitch stood in the air. The reply came faster this time and layered itself, not thicker, just more certain, as when two instruments agree in a room without asking who leads. He advanced one plank, and the sound drew forward as if it had been tied to his ankle invisibly. He advanced another, and it followed. The mist around the far rail lost its insistence. He could see the shape of the last post, and then the color of the paint. Not this year's white, but the enamel from years when budgets were more hopeful. Light changed without brightening. He describes it himself in his lesson notes written later. The air thinned, the boards became dry beneath the foot, and the far shore stepped nearer. He did not claim a vision. He wrote that he recognized the slope of the path when the bridge had been newly planked and the railings still smelled of sap. He wrote that sound moved differently, not faster, just less tired. He writes that he didn't step through anything. He just kept walking, and the world decided to be earlier. On the far side, he stood in a day that had been folded and kept. The houses looked the same but unwrinkled, the mailbox paint more certain, the maple leaves a tone brighter before the season learned restraint. He heard piano practice from a window that had not hosted music in years. The rhythm belonged to scales he had assigned 2 decades earlier, and the pauses had the same shapes a particular student had once carved into them. He followed the path, not far, only to the corner where he could see across the inlet back to the bridge. He saw a figure crossing toward him. He knew the posture immediately because he had carried it. The man put his hand on the rail with a familiarity that said tenure rather than trespass. Beside him stood a teenager with a case, hair pulled back, expression set to solve problems more interesting than adult conversation. He could not hear words. He insists he didn't try. He watched the way the hands moved in air while describing how to settle a shoulder, how to let a bow settle before it speaks. He watched the girl nod and adjust, and he watched them stand side by side as the first note sounded. He doesn't use the word ghost. He writes like a teacher. The tone was centered, the intonation reliable, the dynamic honest to the room, the decay unhurried. He felt the bridge answer, not loudly, not theatrically, but with confidence, and the water received the sound like a page that knows where the margins belong. He blinked. A gust came off the lake, carrying the smell of rain and last week's firewood. The scene thinned as if distance had a hand on it. He stood at the far rail alone, and the boards regained the damp under his shoes. When 2 tourists reached the middle later that morning, they found a folded letter tucked between planks where the rail meets the post. The paper was dry in a damp world, the ink not quite fresh and not quite old. The city maintenance crew collected it, and because small towns still carry habits of neighborliness, delivered it to the address on the envelope. The house was locked at the knob, but not at the deadbolt. On his kitchen table, a kettle sat without steam, and the clock above the stove had stopped in an honest way, hands pointing where they would for a while. For several days, nobody asked loudly where he was. Retirees can take long walks if nobody deserves a schedule. Then the postal worker noticed he hadn't picked up 3 days' worth of ordinary obligations. Neighbors agreed to check. The coat hung where it always did, the felt sleeve on its hook, the tuning fork gone. In the drawer, the letters had been rearranged as if somebody had asked them for assistance. On the piano, he no longer tuned, stood a sheet of lined paper bearing a single staff. On it, D major had been mapped carefully with pencil, all the notes in their places, no ornaments, just the scale itself, a method drawn into a square. That evening, the fog rolled off the lake again briefly, a last exhale before the weather dried into a more conventional October. Several people said they heard a tone while crossing after sunset. It was not loud. It behaved with that particular courtesy sound acquires when it knows you might ignore it. It seemed to come from behind rather than ahead, and it did not change when people tried to match it with their voices. Some stopped walking and listened. They all remember that the note did not waver. Years later, Clara returned to Burlington for reasons that made sense only to paperwork. She did not stay long. She left flowers on the bridge rail, not out of grief, but because the place looked like it made room for small proofs. She told a friend she kept hearing one pitch everywhere that week, not in music, just in the mechanics of town life. The refrigerator settling, the radiator waking, the elevator deciding, the crosswalk's metal throat when it clicked. She thought of looking up Howard and then remembered he wouldn't be there to be found. On the morning she left, there was a letter on her piano in Boston. The envelope had traveled more than most envelopes should. The message inside was short and practical. You still owe me a D major. No signature, no date. The kind of instruction that doesn't require explanation. I visited the bridge the following winter on a gray afternoon when the lake behaved like stone and the wind cut at an angle that makes eyes water without permission. The boards had been replaced since the year of the fog. The city keeps up with its responsibilities. I stood at the midway post and did what everyone does there now. I listened. Car tires on the distant road made their usual cloth tearing sound. A pair of skaters claimed a cove and made soft mistakes. The gulls argued without urgency. Under it all, quiet enough to doubt and steady enough to accept, a pitch held. It did not ask to be named. It sat where it needed to and asked me only to notice. Not all places tolerate that kind of attention. This one did. The bridge didn't promise anything. It simply kept faith with a function the map hadn't included. On my way back across, the boards produced their familiar notes, each plank telling me where I was without flattery. The far shore returned me to errands and a grocery list, and the sense that the week would come whether or not I believed in it. The sound stayed behind me at the same distance, a companion that refused to crowd.
Most bridges teach you forward. A few teach you back. If you ever find yourself on that Burlington span when the fog peels the world down to shape and sound, take the middle slowly. Do not call out. Let the note appear on its own time, then cross as if you remember how. Yesterday is not a door. It's a tone that waits, exactly where you last stood still. So to the fire. The panhandle keeps its hours in straight lines, fence lines, highways, telephone poles that measure the wind. A mile outside Amarillo, a small motor court faces the service road like an old dog that still hears the gate. Inside its office sits a register with blunt pages and a stub of pencil. For 50 years, that book has written the same name most nights, whether the rooms were full, empty, or condemned by the weather. This is not a tale about hauntings. It is a plain account of hospitality that outlived its owners, and of a traveler who learned why a motel would keep one room for someone who never checked out.
The story belongs to an auditor from the state comptroller's office, a woman who had seen more metal desks and coffee-stained receipts than most people see, and who read small towns by their filing cabinets. Her name was Ruth Delgado. She covered a circuit from Wichita Falls to Tucumcari, following sales tax trails for seasonal businesses that forgot to be precise. Amarillo was a routine stop. The motel on the frontage road was not. It kept appearing in her spreadsheets like a thumb pressed under the page. Low income, steady utilities, and occupancy forms stamped on time with the same tidy math. None of that would have mattered if not for a column she noticed by accident. The office door opened to a bell that did not ring so much as agree. Behind the counter sat a blotter, a brass rack for postcards nobody bought, and a guest book that should have been a prop. The register dated back to the year the interstate finished rerouting vacationers. On a slow afternoon, she asked to see it. The owner slid it forward with the ease of someone who had practiced that motion. The paper was heavy and dented by decades of handwriting. Room numbers ran down the left. The right held totals that rarely lied. In the center, there was a name repeated in a nearly unbroken column, stretching back half a century. The handwriting changed hands every few years. The name did not. The initial was always a simple E, the surname a plain word that fit a mailbox, the ink different, but the spacing faithful. The room beside it remained consistent, even when the building renumbered after a renovation. On nights the weather shut the highway, the name appeared early. On nights the lot sat empty, the name appeared near midnight. The sums at the end of each page counted towels and taxes. The name counted something else. She ran her finger down the years and watched owners come and go at the margins. Phone numbers crossed out, logos updated, the accountant replaced. But the guest remained, reliably present, as if being present were a job. A motel registers more than people. Roof tar counts summers, grout counts shoes, the ice machine counts mercy. On the Amarillo property, the wind kept a list no one could read. Ruth walked the row in late afternoon heat and saw what a book could not. Room 12's curtain was always drawn an inch left of the others. The threshold bore a clean spot that came from a habit rather than a mop. Even when the lot was empty, the air outside that door felt slightly cooler, as if someone took a breath every so often and returned it carefully. She watched housekeeping work a steady circuit. Every other door changed posture as carts passed. A wedge of light appeared, a soft thud closed it again. Room 12 opened on its own schedule. Linens went in and came out with the rhythm of a long appointment. Sometimes a towel was hung to dry on the shower rail before the cart reached it, and the attendant put it back in place without surprise, the way a nurse restores an occupied bed and records nothing more dramatic than normal. At the office, the owner gave her the folder. Auditors expect permits, a boiler inspection, a stack of occupancy tax returns with numbers that lined up more obediently than most motels could manage. The electricity usage did not dip on weeks the lot was empty. The ice machine clicked on regardless of bookings. A neon vacancy sign lit the same way every night, as if it remembered the highway before the bypass and still hoped. The books behaved. The building suggested a ritual deeper than behavior. She requested older ledgers. They arrived from a back room that smelled of cardboard and a particular adhesive that stapled panhandle summers into paper. The earliest book began in 1969 the year the roofline in the photographs still showed optimism. The E. Mason signature appeared on the third line of the first week, stayed for a run of nights, and then settled into a pattern that tightened as time passed. It became the evening's punctuation, arriving at the same hand-tired moment when an owner thinks about locking the office and instead counts keys. Ruth checked county records during lunch at a library where the microfilm reader still wore its plastic cover like a shawl. The Amarillo Globe's notices lined up in ordinary ways: fairs, rodeo results, an unkind storm season. But one short article reported a collision west of town in the spring of 1970. A man with that surname had been listed missing after a sedan left the shoulder and found a pasture fence at an angle the highway could not forgive. The reporter summarized the search: a weather front, and the name of a ranch that opened gates to volunteers. The update a week later offered no closure, only gratitude for assistance, and a line promising any personal effects found would be returned to family. There were no obituaries by that name locally. A few years later, a classified ran with a motel's phone number in small type, asking any E. Mason to contact the office regarding a held item. The item was never named. The line appeared twice more that decade, and once in the early 1990s, set smaller each time. The register in the office ignored the newspaper's silence and continued to perform its duty. A name at night, a room that learned to be ready without being instructed out loud. Motels outlive their owners by repeating the steps. A couple buys the property from another couple, changes the sign, keeps the detergent, and learns the quirks the first storm teaches. Ruth traced those handoffs across the ledger margins. A new stamp appeared here, a different sales tax number there, a telephone exchange aging from letters to numerals. The handwriting of the E. Mason line adapted to each era without losing spacing. Whoever penned it learned a slope and kept it, as if the name instructed the hand. Maintenance reports in a box under the counter made the tradition more practical. Room 12's air conditioner had been serviced more often than any other, even when occupancy records showed it rarely booked. The water heater in that run of rooms had a habit of warming early. The night clerk notes, written for insurance, not storytelling, described standard disturbances and all the ways tired people forget their cars have alarms. Nothing odd made the pages. Only the constancy of small care did. When Ruth asked for vendor invoices, the owner passed her a slim pile and a reminder that most of the work was done by relatives or cash and carry. A paper taped inside the office supply cupboard listed items that should never run out: coffee packets, batteries for door locks, small soaps, ledger paper. At the bottom, someone had added an extra line in ballpoint ink that had oxidized to a darker brown than the rest. The line instructed that one room must remain quietly available after dark, regardless of forecasts. The note did not name the room. The housekeeping schedule already knew which one. An auditor does not write what she cannot defend. Ruth tested what could be measured. She compared nightly meter readings to reported occupancy and found a steady uplift during weeks the books showed emptiness. She matched it against weather and discoverable variables. The room in question carried the difference the way a musician carries time when the drummer stops. She stayed on site to remove speculation. In that motel, a hard chair sat next to the office door. trained to face an empty pool and a sky with no intention of helping. She watched the lot till late and wrote down what the building did with and without people. Around 11, a pickup rolled in, let the engine rest, and left again. A family from somewhere east used the ice machine as if it owed them for the day. When midnight leaned on the property, the neon sign kept its faint red rectangle steady across the glass. Room 12's curtain moved the inch she had come to expect. Nothing theatrical, only a private adjustment that marks occupancy more than footsteps do. Near 12:30, the owner emerged with a small tray and set it on the office counter. A pencil, the ledger, and a square of paper towels he used as a blotter. He wrote the column's name, drew a line through the rate field, and wrote nothing in the payment box. He then closed the book, reached for the night latch, let it slide halfway, and returned to the chair to watch the road for a few minutes longer. The ritual concluded without comment. The room did not make a sound. The parking lot accepted the entry as if asphalt balances books too. The panhandle experiments with weather like a bored genius. In late May, a storm peeled the motel's roof 30 feet along the southern edge and made the local news between footage of overturned grain trucks. The city inspector posted a bright notice on the office door. Rooms near the break were patched, the rest closed. Power was cut for 3 nights on that side of the property. An orange cord snaked from the office into a room that wasn't supposed to be drawing current, and the owner placed a generator behind the soda machine to discourage questions. Ruth arrived the next week out of sequence, summoned by a polite email asking whether amended returns would be required if the business closed for repairs. The notice sat on the door like a decision somebody else should make. The office was open. The phone worked. The ledger lay on the counter, and the nights since the storm carried entries that matched the weeks before it, indistinguishable in tone and spacing. The name had not missed. The generator sat silent again. Power had been restored. On the day the contractors cut out drywall in the ruined rooms, Ruth stood at the threshold of 12 and looked in without crossing. The bed was made tighter than policy required. The bathroom door stood ajar to the exact degree familiar from other afternoons. A small glass on the vanity carried a ring of water at its base that could have been an old mark or a new habit. The air had the cool of a unit that cycles a few minutes longer than a timer demands. Nothing in the scene would give comfort to a storyteller hungry for theater. Everything in it satisfied an auditor who respects that not all line items intend to be explained. That evening, she filed a note with her office. She wrote that the business met the statute as to occupancy records and taxes due. She wrote that a manual tradition appeared to govern one room's preparation beyond practical booking. She did not draw conclusions about cause. She did not assign words she had not measured. She pinned a copy of the maintenance line to the back of the file. Keep one room quietly available after dark, and left the explanation column blank because the answer had already chosen its ledger. Years pass on frontage roads by teaching buildings to adopt the weather they face. Owners change, carpets surrender, and registers fill and get boxed in closets with mice-proof lids. Ruth retired before the motel did. She returned once as a traveler without a per diem, choosing Amarillo not for charm, but for the clean rectangle a map draws around the idea of a middle. She parked by the emptiest room and sat for a while before going in. The office had been repainted a brighter color, and the postcards now advertised a canyon an hour south. But the bell agreed with its duty, and the counter still welcomed elbows with patience. The owner was younger and carried the look of someone who bought optimism and debt in the same envelope. The utilities were current, the ice machine had been replaced, the sign had learned LED. The register had surrendered to a thinner book with reinforcement rings, but the column with the same name continued, written with a hand that had adopted the spacing faithfully. The rate field bore a dash. The payment box remained empty. The room number stood where it had always stood, even though the building had been renumbered again. The housekeeping schedule on the back office wall coded the room with a small dot rather than a line, a quiet instruction to prepare it last and best. Ruth sat in her car that evening and watched the property do what it had learned. Around midnight, the office light softened the way older bulbs do in late hours, and the lot became less a space for machines and more a sketch of people who had been there. She saw the curtain shift its inch. She saw the office door settle on the chain with the careful shrug of a person who knows one more task will arrive and chooses to be ready. The highway kept its distant verse. The panhandle sky, always more roof than ceiling, kept its refusals. Long after, when the motel finally gave itself to a newer roofline and a franchise with breakfast, the ledger went to a box at the county museum where volunteers cataloged it by weight and date. A typed card explained nothing except the facts. A roadside motel, a half-century of service, a column that honored a guest named E. Mason most nights. Visitors flipped to their birth years and wedding weeks and found the name present like a witness who doesn't need to be sworn in. At the bottom of one page, a paperclip held an auditor's card, its ink softened by time. On the back, in a precise hand, sat a single, defendable observation. Name recorded, room prepared, consideration received. No total was listed. The book did not require one. I stood there myself, years later, and read enough to understand why Ruth drove off that last night, calmer than she had arrived. An honest ledger does not explain. It testifies. The motel had kept a promise longer than its sign, and the town had allowed it because good towns do the arithmetic of mercy quietly. No one proved who E. Mason was, or whether he ever carried a key. The rooms loved the weather, and the weather loved the ritual, and the ritual paid the bills in a currency that did not need banks. If a traveler needed shelter on a night, the rest of the map forgot them. There was a light, a clean bed, and a column that said, present. That was enough accounting for a place that faced the wind.
Some businesses earn by the transaction. A few earn by the vow. Out past the Amarillo exits, a motel taught itself to keep one room for whoever couldn't say their name yet, and it wrote a name anyway so the door would know to open. The ledger is boxed now, its pages quiet, but the math holds. When a place chooses to stay, it subtracts a little loneliness from the road. If you pass a light like that, give it a nod. Not everything that welcomes you needs proof you arrived. Closer to the fire. Some places never stop keeping time, even after the clock is gone. West of Boise, there's a shallow bend of valley where the old line used to run. Ties sinking back to dirt, rails lifted for scrap, mileposts leaning like tired foremen. In 1963, a night freight rolled out and did not arrive. No wreckage, no smoke, only a silence the county learned to live with. Most years, around the same week in April, the valley remembers. Headlights move where no headlights belong. A low horn combs the dark like a hand over old grain. People shrug or swear it off. The land has its own ledger. Tonight is the long account of a train that never stopped and of the patient ways a place rehearses an unfinished arrival.
The timetable listed train 714 as ordinary work. 2 diesels coupled nose to tail, 12 cars of farm hardware and sacks of seed, 1 mail coach lashed behind like a good habit. Departure 11, 47 p.m. Stop for water if needed near Caldwell. Arrival 12:36 a.m. The run had the feel of muscle memory. Westbound loads in the afternoon, eastbound empties at night. The way irrigation follows melt and invoices follow harvest. On a mild April night, the dispatch notes recorded departure as expected. The telegraph in the depot clicked its brief farewell. A ranch dog lifted its head at the sound and let the valley resume breathing. Somewhere between mileposts 39 and 41, the radio went obediently quiet, not with panic, but with the same tidiness a conductor uses to end a routine call. Section crews searched with lanterns and jeeps and borrowed planes at dawn. There was nothing to photograph, nothing to inventory. Fence wire lay torn for a mile, as if some great thing had brushed a sleeve across it without malice. Gravel bore the memory of weight, and then changed its mind. The trestle over Dry Creek was intact. The newspaper printed what a newspaper prints when it runs out of verbs. Missing, presumed, ongoing. In the superintendent's file, a note with a practical tone instructed clerks to keep the paperwork aligned while the lawyers decided which name would explain it least expensively. The line shrank by autumn. Mail shifted to road. Freight learned shortcuts. The depot began to close rooms. It could no longer justify heating. The rails were lifted in sections over the next decade. The right-of-way slept. It is a kind sleep, the kind that keeps one eye open. The first reliable report came from someone who distrusted stories. Ruth Anders calibrated barometers and wrote storm scripts for radio so commuters could decide when to leave early. Instruments were her allegiances. One September night, she set up a portable seismograph near the foothills to check whether micro tremors would interfere with the new antenna. The needle ticked its fine language along the baseline. At 11:46, it began to jump in 10-second pulses. Steady intervals, too regular for wind, not near enough to thunder. She stepped out into air that felt padded, the way a snow day muffles without snow. Along the curve where the line had once been, a glow gathered. 2 pale discs level with the horizon, not the pitch of oncoming trucks, too high for farm lights, moving at an unembarrassed pace. There was no diesel throb, only a pressure against the skin as if something large rearranged molecules politely. The sage bent once and held that posture. The light slid through the bend, softened, and left the valley blank again. Later, the tape refused to admit anything more dramatic than a series of pulses, 10 seconds apart, ending at 11:47. She logged it as a ground anomaly and placed the folder where careful people put events that will not defend themselves on paper. Still, a pattern joined her. The next April, and the one after. The needle did its small dance near midnight if the night ran dry, and the wind held off. The station manager grew used to Ruth's voice late in spring evenings, precise and calm, noting pressure drops that had no storm to wear. Long before hikers found the right-of-way scenic, a foreman named Ellison drove it in a county truck out of habit, then in his own pickup after the county forgot the route. He said the line did not like being ignored. On a Friday in the late 1970s, he found twin impressions pressed into grass where ballast used to lie. Clean, parallel, spaced like steel, running straight toward the old trestle. The Dry Creek decking had fallen away. There was nothing to carry even a cat across. Yet the marks continued beyond the gap for a few strides of air before fading, like a sentence that realizes it has outrun punctuation. He hammered a spike into dirt where the rails would have rejoined, a small ceremony for his own benefit, then went home without stopping at the tavern. After that, neighbors noticed his porch light burning at 11:45 most Fridays. He did not say why. Some rituals do not ask for an audience. The spike rusted down over the years until a boy on a bicycle kicked it loose and took it home, thinking it lucky. The trestle rot sank to the logic of water. Ellison's truck began to appear in town less often, then not at all. But the nicks he'd left in fence posts where he parked remained, and every April a thin, bright scrape renewed itself along one of them, as if a very heavy thing had brushed by at a courtesy distance. In the county museum, a retired clerk named Helen Parker sorted timetables and stapled small histories to bigger ones. She found that the ledger for 1963 never showed a canceled run. The column that should have carried a neat diagonal line closing the route carried instead the last exact departure and a blank where arrivals usually scolded the future into alignment. Railroads do not like blanks. She wrote to the successor company and received a form letter that said, "Absorption into alternate routing," a phrase that means responsibility has been routed into the hallway between departments. Helen pinned the letter above her desk and began leaving a thermos on the old depot bench each April. Coffee, black, lid unscrewed to a polite degree, as if a crew might pass and accept a small kindness nobody needed to be thanked for. The thermos was always lighter in the morning. She told no one. She had lost enough people to know what secrecy preserves. When school groups toured the museum, she let the children hammer a dull spike into a piece of tie and listen for the note wood makes when it accepts work. On years when the river ran high, the echo came back stronger than it should have, as if the ground still expected weight. Bureaucracy committed its own folklore. A form in an archive in Pocatello continued to list 714 as active in a forgotten field. A payroll ledger from the dispatcher's desk carried a penciled note, "Recalculate horn oil allotment," that never learned it was not needed. Paper learns the habits of the hands that touch it. Some hands refuse to let go. The sheriff's logs recorded the valley's rehearsal at a human scale. Now and then, a caller complained that windows shivered once near midnight, the way they do when a truck passes fast, though no truck climbed the county road at that hour. Dogs warned the air and then apologized. A deputy parked by the crossing one April night and wrote, in the careful script of people who have to read themselves on the stand, that the room inside his cruiser grew grainy at 11:47. The radio found static it did not usually want. The dash clock dimmed and then behaved. the headlights hummed, the way filaments do moments before failure, and then regained pride. In the morning, the asphalt wore faint, parallel scuffs where none of the county's vehicles had reason to drive. Teenagers tested the legend the way teenagers test doors. They camped where the embankment is lowest and returned home with bravado. Their stories were untrustworthy in tone, but remarkably consistent in detail. The light never blasted, it drifted. The horn did not shout, it moaned from a distance that could not be found with feet. The ground did not shake like disaster. It throbbed, as if asking the body to remember something heavy. They took photographs that showed nothing a parent would value and kept them anyway. Wind farms began to chew the ridges north of the valley. The red aviation lights pulsed at a responsible pace and taught the night a new rhythm. Still, each April, the older rhythm showed up between pulses and minded its own schedule. 4 decades after her first anomaly, Ruth came back with newer equipment and less appetite for certainty. Her gait had shortened. She set the tripod slower. She placed one camera toward the curve and another toward herself, an insurance against the convenient lies single lenses tell. A pressure sensor settled on the gravel where the rails used to cling. A small recorder took a breath of the night and waited. At 11:41, the insects thinned until the silence had its own texture. A cold gathered along the ground as if water walked uphill. The pressure needle sagged 2 millibars. A hum arrived from nowhere, not a pitch so much as the idea of one. The cameras saw it before she admitted it. Light broadening along the old alignment, 2 discs where lamps should be, level as a carpenter's bubble, moving at the pace of something confident. The recorder caught a low metallic swell that did not bloom into engine but held to a courteous volume, as if the sound traveled through earth and came up underfoot. For 8 seconds, the timestamp on the forward camera did not advance. On the rear camera, the second hand continued calmly across Ruth's wristwatch. The valley had picked a clock. She stood without moving, and the light slid through her like memory slides through a mind that has practiced this passage. The horn, if horn is the word when there is nothing to carry it, laid down one long bar of sound and let the night keep the tale. The pressure rose again. The insects remembered their jobs, and the grass took back the shape of grass. On review the next day, the data behaved like polite absence. The lens flares could be argued with. The 8 silent seconds could be blamed on heat or battery. The hum underfoot refused argument. It stayed on the file like a signature you cannot quite read, but recognize anyway. Her report did not overreach. She wrote that a periodic event with acoustic and barometric features recurred at the same hour and week across multiple years. She wrote that the source was not meteorological, vehicular, or aircraft. She allowed a sentence that engineers do not like writing. The valley appears to be replaying an impulse. The right-of-way is a trail now. Cyclists ride it in afternoons. Runners look east and measure their health by how quickly the hills approach. At night, the county keeps the path unlit, and the wind comes down with the same unpersuadable mind it used when there were rails to lean on. If you stand by the old signal post, the iron still weathering slower than everything else, you will feel, beneath your shoes, a pulse. 10 seconds apart. 10 again. 10. The body begins to expect the next one in the way the chest expects its next breath. It is not dramatic. It is simply regular. Locals do not gather in costume or sell t-shirts. They do what places do when they have made peace with a fact. Porch lights burn a little longer the week the anomaly comes round. The museum keeps a box where school children leave paper trains drawn in crayon, all of them pointed toward a station door that no longer opens. Folks driving home late sometimes see light braided with low fog over the alfalfa and do not mention it at breakfast because the day deserves not to be asked for proof. Every once in a while, the county crews repaint the reflective crossbuck at the road, even though nothing crosses, because paint is cheap and warnings are cheaper than sorrow. I walked that bend last autumn when the fields had gone the color of straw and the river carried only enough music to keep stones from forgetting. A frost smell rode the ditch grass. The moon hung low and reasonable. At 11:47, the night's floor tilted an idea thicker. I did not turn toward the bend first. I looked into the black window of a farmhouse and felt a room listening along with me. The light came, an improvement on darkness rather than a violation of it, and traveled exactly where the diagram in a depot book would have put it. I stood with the valley and let it move through. No one arrived because arrival is a word for schedules, and this is a matter of habit. The habit, however, is generous. It does not frighten. It gathers, proceeds, and leaves the air cleaner than it found it, the way a vow leaves a space both emptier and more honest once it is spoken.
Trains obey rails. Memory obeys itself. Out near Boise, the earth remembers the weight that trusted it and repays the favor by keeping the hour. If you ever find yourself there in April with the cold coming up through your shoes, don't wait for an explanation. Let the light pass, let the horn thread the night, and carry that steady interval home like a quiet metronome. Some journeys keep moving not to arrive, but to remind the dark it is being watched. The fire knows this. So does the valley. So now do you. To the fire. The Pacific Northwest keeps two kinds of midnight, the one the clocks admit and the one rain invents under streetlights. In Eugene, Oregon, a stainless steel diner sits 2 blocks off the river, quiet by day, polite by evening, and peculiar after 12. When the town rolls over, the lights in that dining car learn their brightness again. The neon rediscovers its loop, and an old tabletop radio finds the one station that survived the century. No keys turn, no hands reach. It is a business that has kept a small promise longer than its owners, and a town that lets it. This isn't a lesson, and it isn't a haunting. It is a record of how a room can remember what it's for.
This story belongs to a facilities coordinator named Hannah Price, a person whose job teaches her to notice the difference between off and almost. She tended properties for the city, shelters near the mill race, a couple of small parking structures, the public restrooms by the river path that learned the hard way about weather and people. Her route at night was simple. Check locks, test lights, write down the hours when machines forgot themselves. It meant she learned to trust reflections because glass tells the truth faster than sensors do. There is a diner on a corner where the grid softens near the railroad, a silver-sided car anchored to a concrete pad since the Eisenhower years. In the afternoon, it sells grilled cheese and onions that remind the block it still lived in. At 10, they sweep. At 11, they count the drawer. At 11:30, they turned the sign to dark. Or so it went until a winter of steady rain taught Hannah the pattern. On a Tuesday in February, after her rounds, she cut along that block for the cover the awning gave. The window metal gathered raindrops into tidy rows. Inside, the booths sat like patient library chairs. The red neon script, DINER, was still. But as she moved past the last pane, a faint ivory grew along the counter edge, the way a fish's belly brightens underwater. Fluorescence above the grill answered with a delay that felt intentional. Then the tabletop radio on the back shelf woke from whatever radios do between stations and found an oldie shaped like a sigh. No one moved. The door stayed locked. The cook's clock over the pass insisted it was 5 minutes to midnight and not interested in negotiations. Hannah stood under the awning and watched, the way one watches a self-playing piano in a museum, respectful of the mechanism, wary of conclusions. She didn't knock. She didn't film it. She noted it in the small notebook where she wrote down drifted schedules and lights that refused to retire. Diner at 12, on by itself, radio low. People in rainy towns measure time by maintenance. The next night, she passed by again, not by assignment, just to see if the room would keep its word. It did. The open sign did not flip. The deadbolt did not argue. Yet the ceiling lights walked up through their buzz. The grill hood blinked to life as if a ghost of bacon warranted a filter. And the radio found a station that didn't exist at noon. It never blared, not even once. Volume sat just enough above the refrigerator drone to be company. By the end of the week, she had learned the minute hand's tempo. The light staged itself 2 minutes before the clock surrendered midnight. The radio joined 9 seconds later, habit precise as a metronome when nobody claps. On Saturdays, the room lingered 20 minutes past 1. On weeknights, it faded earlier, tired like everyone else. The rain didn't matter. The pattern lived whether the morning would open into blue, into mist, or into another gray that asked for patience. Hannah tried to find the timer because the mind prefers machinery to mercy. She looked up permit histories in a database that still remembered the diner as a mobile structure, despite 6 decades of anchoring. The electrical upgrades listed kitchen circuits that had been proud in 1989 and a hood fan replaced after a grease fire that embarrassed the owner. There was no timer for the main banks, no after-hours test cycle noted in the service calls. Health inspection logs worried about refrigeration, but never about metaphysics. She stopped at a community center manager's office to trade gossip like technicians do. Nobody owned the story, but several knew the rumor. A custodian claimed he saw the coffee maker heat itself 3 times a winter. A street sweeper said the neon liked fog better than clear air. A patrol officer rolled his sleeve to show goose flesh and grinned when he said it. If the radio plays after midnight, the city will sleep fine. If it doesn't, someone will forget to lock something. It was a joke, but jokes take their shapes from use. On paper, the diner had changed names 5 times. First a family's, then a daughter's, then an LLC that looked like a cousin's shell, then a partnership that installed Kraft ketchup and modern fonts. Then, back to a single owner who folded the menu into fewer decisions. The building watched them all and kept the same artist's signature of grease gloss along the grill rail. Hannah found the insurance binder on a public clerk's site. redacted in all the useful places and generous in the parts that never help. What mattered was a page no one had bothered to digitize well, a photocopy of a handwritten checklist taped to the fuse closet since the 70s. The note wasn't romantic. It said exactly what rooms want. Warm this first, cool that second, never turn the sign off at the wall, but at the chain, and leave the radio at the numbered notch that makes the night behave. A line in another hand had been added across the bottom in lighter pen, somewhere in the early 90s, guessing at the ink. If nobody comes after the dishwasher leaves, the diner will test itself at midnight. Do not interfere. She visited the library during a lunch break and unrolled microfilm of the local paper until her wrists disliked her. She found nothing dramatic. No midnight club that met there. No city ordinance encouraging unstaffed hospitality. No obituary for a cook who swore to finish a shift from the other side. She found ads with prices that now feel like jokes and headshots of waitresses whose smiles understood long nights. She found a flood notice from a winter when the mill race lost patience and the diner fought it with towels. And she found a photo of the owner's husband in 1964 standing beside a new radio with a caption that bragged about always-on news. Rooms learn from instructions and from stubborn people who believe in them. She made a copy of the photocopy, not because the city required it, but because common sense does. Any pattern worth believing has to survive an interruption. In March, a windstorm played with the river valley like a loose cord. Limbs broke, branches traveled where they had no business going, and a substation coughed at the wrong moment. Blocks went dark. Emergency lights learned their red faces. Hannah's phone lit up with small crises, the kind she could fix and the kind she could only narrate. She set cones around a blinking intersection and answered 3 versions of the same question from 3 different drivers. At 11:50, she passed the diner without expecting company. The building held its own outline against the storm, silver siding wet as new fish, windows holding nothing but the reflection of a town having a moment, the dead street throwing back only what it had. Hannah hooded her phone and checked the grid map some engineer had taught her to love. Restoration would take until 1. At 12:02, a low orange came from inside the diner. No fluorescence, no joke of daylight, just a warm run of bulbs along the back shelf that did not owe their dignity to the utilities line. Battery, she thought. Or the emergency circuit the health code had insisted on, but the electrician had sworn it wouldn't service anything but egress. The radio joined, not with the station, but with the confidence of one. Close AM air, the steady hush of a carrier wave, then the small, heroic click of a tuner completing its circle and finding a voice. It wasn't music. It was a weather bulletin decades old, the kind of voice that said lows in the 40s after morning fog, with a trust that no longer exists on air. The bulletin finished, the carrier held, the bulbs glowed, and the storm resumed its regular work beyond the glass. Power returned to the block at 1:07. The bulbs inside the diner were patient a little longer, then forgot themselves the way good machines do when the room doesn't need them. She wrote it down. Opens in outage, stays polite. Every mystery in a working town tends toward an ordinary face. Late in spring, an older man with a mail carrier's walk started sitting on the bus bench across from the diner at 11:50, rain or not. Never under the awning, always the bench. He set a thermos beside him and rested his hands palm down as if feeling the neighborhood's heartbeat. He came the first night in a corduroy cap, the second in a sky blue windbreaker with a postal patch retired into a memory, the third with no hat and a haircut the barber gave to people he liked. Hannah asked around because asking is how towns function. A clerk at the county office knew the man's daughter. The man had worked routes in Eugene since zip codes were new. He had sorted letters in the dark of winter mornings when the river's breath tried to turn paper into wool. He had retired with good ankles and bad patience. He stayed in the neighborhood because sometimes the shortest distance between two pasts is the same block. On a Tuesday, he had wandered into the diner at 10 to ask for pie and found the counter sleepy and the server cleaning an imaginary stain. The room did not offer pie after 10 anymore. He apologized to nobody in particular and left. A week later, he began the bench routine like it had been assigned. When midnight arrived, the lights affirmed their part, and the radio settled into a station that played old warblers whose first names were enough. The man poured coffee into a small lid that pretended to be a cup, raised it as if to toast the air, and nodded. He didn't try the handle. He didn't test the lock. He kept 2 fingers on the thermos as if to ground the toast to a chassis. After half an hour, he rose, placed the lid back with a care usually reserved for glass, and walked home with the even gait of someone who had learned long ago how to cross a city in any weather. It went on for a month. She timed her loop to see it, not to interfere. The night learned him, and the room learned him, and the bus bench remembered the weight it held by leaving the glint of a circle in rain where the thermos had rested. Hannah never harassed the owner, who was tired enough of daytime and used up by lunch. She did ask about the switch panel once, and the answer came in the shape of a shrug that holds both pride and surrender. There are jobs you work and jobs that work you. The owner pointed her to the laminated morning checklist. Power the hood, warm the griddle, bring the milk forward. Nothing about midnight. That part belonged to a different sheet of paper nobody could find because it was taped to a fuse box that had been replaced. One early summer night, the owner forgot a pan and came back near 12. Hannah happened to be rounding the corner as she pulled in. The owner froze at the glass, not surprised, not pleased, just resigned to the fact that rooms have schedules. She unlocked the door, went straight to the back, set her pan under the prep counter, and then did something that made more sense than questions. She sat on a stool and let the room continue. The fluorescent hum lifted in long arcs. The coffee warmer ticked a heartbeat against the steel, and the radio located a station that no algorithm would have favored. Hannah stayed under the awning and drew a small circle with her finger on the glass to see in. The owner never touched a switch. At 12:17, she wiped a clean counter and aligned a stack of plates that did not require alignment. At 12:23, she turned the closed placard, so the blank back faced the street, which is not technically the same as admitting open, but lets the night save face. At 12:30, the older man arrived, nodded from the bench, and lifted the lid cup just enough for the room to notice. The owner didn't wave. Waving would have been theater. She set a napkin on the counter as if it were owed the air and waited with a patience that had nothing to do with wages. At 12:41, the radio played a song the diner had recognized in every decade. A voice with a little iron in it, a drum that refused ornament, a melody that understood how to be background without quitting the job. The owner let the song finish. She switched nothing off. She locked the door on her way out, and the lights minded themselves 15 minutes later, as if obeying an instruction written somewhere the city had no jurisdiction to read. By August, the rumor stopped being a rumor and settled into something smaller and more useful, like the knowledge of which crosswalk buttons believe you. Nearby apartments learned to fall asleep by the radio's fade. Cyclists cutting home along the river path knew that if the neon edge inside the glass flickered just before the hour, the rain would be kind until dawn. A drummer from a bar 3 blocks away swore the diner's hum ran at the exact tempo that helped him walk the kit down without waking his elbows. A hotel night clerk pointed guests toward the corner when insomnia made them ask for a safe place to stand. Hannah took 1 week off in September. When she came back, the bench looked lonelier than a bench should. She asked the clerk again. The postal worker's daughter had moved him to a house with fewer stairs. He was well enough, just farther from the river. He sent a note through a friend that most people now forget to send. Thank whoever keeps the midnight right where it belongs. The friend mislaid the note on a kitchen counter as friends do, then found it 2 days later and delivered it anyway. Hannah read it once and folded it into the pocket of the notebook that owed the city more practical details than gratitude. The rains returned properly by October. The smell of wet cedar took up residence in coats and cars. At 12:03 on the first Monday with real fog, the radio inside the diner began with a low voice that belonged to no era. It read the marine forecast the way forecasters used to read it when they believed in diction. Winds variable to 5 knots, waves light, visibility restricted in morning hours. No one in the room owned a boat. No one needed the forecast. Rooms collect frequencies like lint, and sometimes lint is useful because it proves a sweater is being used. The owner taped a new laminated card to the fuse closet for the health inspector and anyone else who might inspect the inspector. If the diner opens itself at midnight, leave it be. The inspector didn't argue because the entry log showed no unmanaged people, and the temperature log showed no danger to mayonnaise. The city doesn't regulate how rooms remember. Hannah's notebook ran out of pages before winter. The last line she wrote about the diner was not a measurement and not a request. It said, "Keeps faith."
Some places learn their hours and stand by them. A stainless steel room by a wet corner in Eugene opens itself after midnight, not to serve burgers or coffee, but to keep the town company while it sleeps. The light is small and the radio older than most of its listeners, but the effect is the same as a hand left on a shoulder a moment longer than necessary. If you pass by, don't try the handle. Let the room do its work. The night counts on a few steady things, and when they keep faith, everyone else can rest. Fires, neon, radios. The honest ones know when to be quiet and when to say, "Here we are, still." So to the fire. Maine keeps a hard edge where the water lifts its shoulder against the land. Near Bar Harbor stands a light that retired its lamp years ago, but storms still find a beam where no lens turns. This isn't a tale about ghosts asking to be believed. It is a record of a coastline that remembers how to point a way through weather, and of the people who learn to let it.
This story belongs to a maintenance supervisor named Cole Whitaker, a man whose calendar smelled of salt and machine oil. He kept the keys to a scatter of municipal buildings, the little pump house by the shore path, the bandstand that learned every summer how to do its job again, and the decommissioned lighthouse on a rock that the town adopted when the Coast Guard handed it over. He was not sentimental. He counted tasks with the stoicism of a tide table. Scrape, paint, replace, grease, record. His truck bed always held a coil of rope, a bucket, and a ledger that only made sense to him. The light had been dark officially since the automation era decided the new offshore tower did the work better. The Fresnel lens had been removed, crated, and shipped to a museum 2 counties away where it sat inside glass that protected glass. The keeper's house had surrendered to tours on Saturday afternoons when the weather behaved, and to photographs the rest of the time. The old lamp room wore its vacancy with a dignity that salty iron learns. Cole visited twice a month, more in winter. He walked the ramp, checked the locks, and noted whether storms had tossed pebbles where they had no right to be. The lantern deck offered that wide view New England sells without apology. Granite shouldering out of dark water, a thin seam where cloud and sea negotiated, spruce on the shore holding the line of town. On calm days, the rock was a postcard. On rough days, it became the honest version of itself. The first time the beam appeared on his watch, he thought the mind can embarrass itself with memory. A nor'easter worked the bay like someone tugging a sheet. The automated offshore beacon threw its regulated blink into the spray. Yet along the low run of water between the point and the shipping lane, a tight white fell and rose on a sweep that did not match any charted rhythm. He looked for a boat that might explain it, and saw only weather arranged by purpose. He raised his phone, then lowered it. Cameras confirm and they also reduce. He watched instead and filed it where stubborn people file the things they will later verify. By morning, the town behaved as if the storm had never been a problem. The power crews did their parade down Mount Desert Street. The fishermen at the co-op arranged their crates in the wet light that follows a front. Cole wrote a single line in his ledger and underlined it once. He was not a man given to multiple underlines. Storms repeated through spring with the regularity of anything that likes its job. A beam that should not exist returned only when the weather argued loud enough to drown an explanation. It did not appear early or linger. It arrived in the hour when the wind had finished making its case, and the sea began to settle from fury to heavy breathing. The sweep did not care about tourists, and it did not raise a town's temperature. It treated each event like a shift that begins and ends on time. Cole tested what he could. He checked the breaker panel that had fed the lantern a lifetime ago. It was cold metal and sensible dust. He traced the conduit up the spiral, found splices taped by people who had learned their trade when tape came in one color, and confirmed the obvious. Nothing electrical had the energy to pretend to be a star. He borrowed a handheld meter from a friend at the marina. The reading wavered toward noise, while the beam ran and returned to boredom when it faded. He chalked that up to static that weather breeds. fishermen are worse than barometers and better than maps. A few of them mentioned a sweep in the corner of their eyes on the nights when the bell buoy seemed to move closer than the bell had any right. They said it without needing to say it. The offshore tower did what it always does: patient, correct, far. But something tight and near found the channel, the way an old hand finds a tool on a dark workbench. No one looked eager to hold a meeting about it. Good towns let useful facts live at the scale that lets them work. A retired teacher who lived year-round on the point sent the harbor master a note that her living room had flickered pleasantly during the last gale, even though she had switched off the lamps to spare the grid. The harbor master placed the note in a drawer with slips that did not require reward. The drawer contained guarantee cards for radios, a badge a summer ranger had left behind, and a child's drawing of a lighthouse beam that was entirely too strong for the crayon it was born of. Cole settled into the idea slowly. The light did no harm, asked for no announcement, and spared him meetings. It arrived to do a piece of the job its lens had once done, and left before anyone could complain. He made a space for it in the ledger, just a narrow column with dates and the word seen. Decommissioned buildings do not forget the verbs that name them. The keeper's quarters smelled of cedar and salt so honestly that tours required no guide. In a closet that now held extra rope and a stack of donated raincoats, Cole found a wooden box with the kind of latch a careful person makes. Inside lay a thin book, the keeper's private log from the last man to live full-time with the lamp. The official station log had gone to the archives. This was the diary of the rhythms that do not fit paperwork. The writing was blunt and clear, a habit formed by someone who worked with weather rather than opinion. Pages listed day shapes, barometer drop and fog steps, paint scraped from south window, gull repelled with dignity, lamp polished to the standard of a pride that is not vanity. The last weeks before automation carried a tone he recognized from other trades when machines begin to stand in the place where hands used to earn their nights. The man had trained his successor on maintaining what would remain: stairs, glass, dignity. One entry held. It described a storm and a sweep that matched nothing on the schedule. The keeper wrote that the lamp had been shuttered for maintenance when the weather arrived, that the lens sat quiet on its cradle, and that the room had nevertheless filled with the kind of brightness that makes details precise rather than theatrical. The beam had swept once and again, not from the lens but from the bluff itself, as if the geometry had been borrowed from the memory of angles rather than from optics. He did not say miracle. He wrote that the sea had accepted instruction and that a small boat out beyond the furthest rock corrected its course with gratitude that would never have a name. Cole closed the book and placed it back in the box with a care that surprised him. He cleaned the latch and oiled the hinge. He did not add a note because some objects do not need a second voice. Summer misled visitors with postcards and then remembered who it was. On a hot day that smelled of sunscreen and rope, the forecast held out its hand and asked the town to be reasonable. By late afternoon, the first drops arrived sideways. The offshore tower clicked through its cadence. The ferry to the island adjusted to a shuffle the captain had learned the hard way. Police tape appeared at the end of a pier in that careful, municipal way that still allows stubborn people to step around it. Cole walked the ramp at 11 with his hood up and the sort of balance that comes from making peace with slick steps. The rock shook itself like a large animal. The lantern room glass had been cleaned the week before and now offered the satisfying insult of being immediately dirty in an admirable way. He made the circuit, felt each bolt with his palm the way mechanics touch and read, and then stood with the simple invitation a person offers a tide when there is no conversation to be had. The beam did not come with ceremony. It presented itself as clarity learned from long use. It traveled the arc the lens had taught the room and laid down a lane of white along the water as clean as chalk on a blackboard. It did not fight the offshore tower. It collaborated at a shorter distance with the immediate human scale a small boat cares about. The foghorn sounded in the throat of the channel with that unembarrassed sorrow it has. For 1 minute, the lighthouse that owned no light behaved with all the confidence of being itself. A skiff that had no business still being out there became slightly less wrong. The bow found a better angle against the wind, the way the hand finds a stair rail in the dark and learns about gravity again. It was not a rescue. It was a correction. The sweep repeated once, then again, then stopped as if the room had put the tool back in its drawer. Cole did not applaud, because the sea accepts neither applause nor pity. He noted the hour, the direction, the duration. He walked down in the rain with the same concentration he used on the way up. Back in the truck, he wrote the single line the ledger required. The heater scented the cab with wet wool and rubber. The night finished its statement and began the quiet after clause. Bar Harbor carries tourists with politeness and year-rounders with muscle memory. In a small town, information travels the way fog does, through trees, around corners, reappearing as something other parts of the town already know. The beam became not a myth and not a notice but a courtesy. A lobsterman who had lost patience with a jammed winch said his hand steadied when the sweep walked the water to port. A kayaker who should have been home an hour earlier felt his ribcage loosen when a lane of brightness made the black surface look less like an argument. A Coast Guard petty officer with no time for romance logged the offshore beacon as functioning and wrote nothing about the other light, because forms do not invite that kind of truth. Cole collected nothing but dates and weather shapes. He is not the person who tells a story before it is ready. He cleaned the paint from a hinge and watched a set of tourists take a picture with a kind of reverence that had nothing to do with the beam and everything to do with their vacation, surviving the moodiness of a coast. He replaced shingles on the lee side where the wind had begun to test arguments. He took a school group to the base of the stair, described the Fresnel in a way that made a fourth grader understand liking a lens, and left out the part about storms. Children have their own currents. Adults do not get to steer them toward legend on purpose. That autumn, a local historian who knew which doors to knock on asked the museum 2 counties away for a loan of the lens. The museum sent paper and a polite refusal anchored to insurance and the difficulty of moving fragile greatness through such rude air. The historian stopped trying because she had wanted the conversation, not the object. The town did not need the lens back. The rock already broadcast what it remembered when asked. A winter gale promised to be educational. Cole carried a portable logger in the pocket of his rain shell that he'd borrowed from the university's marine lab. He did not ask permission because the device had been orphaned on a shelf, and institutions like their people to use tools. The logger woke when the magnetic field around it tilted and recorded nonsense and music with equal respect. He stood 3 storms in a row on the landing halfway up the stair and let the room teach his ears the difference between fear and instruction. During the second storm, the offshore light vanished and reappeared inside its own rules. The beam from the dark lighthouse ran for 52 seconds in 3 passes, each pass tighter and more sure than the last. The logger showed a brief and arrogant quiver at a frequency that lived where old transformers hum when they are happy. He could not prove it later to anyone who did not already want to believe, and he had no appetite for that audience. He copied the data to a cheap drive and taped the drive inside the wooden log box beneath the private diary, a kind of offering to the sensible gods of record keeping. He tried one human experiment he regretted before he finished it. He carried a small battery lantern to the base of the bluff and lifted it once the sweep began, thinking to see whether light liked company. The beam ignored him with the dignity of a master craftsman who does not adjust for an apprentice mid-task. He set the lantern down and let the sea do its math. The beam finished, paused half its usual interval, returned for a final small arc as if to acknowledge the thought, and stopped. He learned what he should have known. Some systems only become visible when you stop participating. Whenever the beam failed to appear, he stood without impatience. Not every storm demands guidance. Some only want attention. On those nights, the offshore tower did its clockwork, the foghorn did its sorrow, and the rock held its counsel. He gave the weather his hat brim and his presence, and left with no more to say. Years stack in maritime towns, the way rope coils. Each loop lies against the last, and both remember the hand that placed them. The lighthouse continued its twice monthlies, then more when the forecasts recommended humility. The ledger grew weight at the back, where pages filled with a narrow language. Gale, nor'easter, swell from southeast, seen. A spring tide lifted higher than anyone liked and took a section of walkway, but left the lantern deck alone in the way the sea reserves for things it respects. When Cole retired, the town gave him a cake that pretended to be the shape of the rock and a watch that knew better than weather. He left the keys in the drawer where the next person would expect them. He slid the wooden log box a few inches to the left so its latch would clear a stubborn lip, the kind of move one leaves behind when one is done teaching. He walked the ramp one last time in daylight and told the place nothing, because places do not want speeches. He went home to a house that had learned the rhythm of his boots. That autumn, a storm arrived with such sincerity that even the souvenir stores closed without pretending it was optional. The offshore tower ran its metronome. The beam from the dark light began before anyone needed it and lasted just long enough for every window facing the bay to feel a brief, clinical calm. Restaurant staff who had stacked chairs on tables stopped for the length of a breath and recognized something they did not sign for but were willing to accept. A single late sailboat on a mooring tightened its line as if muscles had been added to rope. I stood at the shore path under a hood that did little and watched the rock hold itself steady against a world that had other plans. The beam swept in that efficient arc, Not a performance, a function. The rain flattened for a moment inside its lane, and then remembered verticality. The foghorn sounded with its old grammar. The hill behind me gathered the sound and returned it without boasting. The light ended itself and left a cleaner dark behind, the way a good ending should. The lens in the museum 2 counties away continued to sit with its self-importance inside glass. School groups learned vocabulary words about prisms. The volunteer did not know she was telling half a truth, and therefore did an excellent job. The town at the Rock did not envy the museum its object. The Rock had kept the thing that mattered, the habit. In the keeper's quarters, the private diary and the cheap drive balanced each other like 2 neighbors who wave from porches and do not require more. The next supervisor wrote smaller than Cole and did not underline. She brought a thermos and left it on the 3rd stair during weather, which taught the room a new detail to carry without remark. When storms lift their shoulder against the land, the lighthouse that owns no lamp still lays down a strip of precision across the throat of the bay. It is not a miracle. It is a muscle memory the place has refused to surrender.
Not every light needs a bulb. Some places shine because they remember how. Out near Bar Harbor, a retired tower keeps its promise when the water turns difficult. If you're there in weather, don't ask it to explain. Let the beam make its pass. Let the horn carry the note, and walk home by the lane they leave behind. Fires do this. So do old rooms. They go on working after the world says they're done.